The Black man's body has been the subject of fascination and research within European scholarship since the 17th century. This is according to Mr. Tonono. My name is Isasipinkosi Mdingi. I am your host here at the Young Researchers Hub, where science and the public becomes one. Today we are having Mr. Siyabulela Tonono as our guest, where he will be tackling two topics on different two papers he has published, where he interrogates the Black man and everything that has been happening around a Black man since the 17th century, or rather the 19th century as we go forward. Mr. Siyabulela Tonono completed his undergraduate studies at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, majoring in political science and philosophy and law. Currently enrolled for his honors in historical studies at the University of Cape Town. His research publications have broadly focused on the understanding the role that the 19th century Christian missionaries have played in shaping contemporary discourses of Black masculinities in South Africa. Mr. Siyabulela's broad research interests are on casting a decolonial thought or light in the understanding of South African history. To that effect, his work seeks to explore the historical archive that is embedded within isiXhosa and to unpack the historical narratives that are laden within Xhosa idiomatic and linguistic expression. Mr. Siyabulela, thank you very much for your time, and we welcome you to the Young Researchers Hub. Just to mention his topic that he'll be talking on today, he has written two papers that we'll be unpacking today. Let us make men in our own image, the mission station as a site of Black emasculation in 19th century South Africa. The second one is Uyajola 99 Utatako, Missionaries and Black masculinities. These are two papers that are looking at Black masculinities since the 19th century. Mr. Siyabulela, how are you today?
Thank
you for your time, and thank you for allowing us to tap into your work and hear your views on this topic that I think is very important. We mostly focus on unpacking women issues in most of the time, and we forget there's other people, or don't say other people, but forget that there's men within our coexistence as a people. And the discourse of Black men is one that is been under interrogation, but not on the lenses of our people, or rather on the lenses of their own stories. And thank you for writing these papers for us to learn from them.
For the platform. Thank you very much for engaging with my work, sharing my scholarly work, and just giving me the platform to kind of share my thoughts and go through some of my research. So Namdi Abulela in that regard for the platform.
Thank you. So I've went through both of your papers, and which unpack the discourse again of Black masculinities since the 19th century, that's where your research is main focus. But before we enter into the research, I want to understand why particularly this area, and what is I understand your framework is on decoloniality, and what influences that framework also, and basically why are you focusing on this area? Where did you see the gap, and what was the most appealing thing that was supposed to be discussed that you felt was not being discussed?
So a bit of background. In my past lifetime, I used to work within the Gender Justice and Service Desk of the Methodist Church of Southern Africa. And part of my work focused on gender-based violence and looking to understand how churches can respond to issues of gender-based violence. And within those discourses, there was a sort of a gap in how we understand how the church has shaped society. And also looking to understand, and so these works, the research that I published was mainly during that time when I was still within the Methodist Church, working for the Methodist Church, and it's work that I had done looking to understand how has the church how has the church shaped our discourses of gender and how we understand that. And a particular interest of mine as a Black man became to look at how are masculinities, how are the dominant forms of masculinities in South Africa, how have they been shaped and reshaped, particularly by the church as an institution now. And then I did a bit of the historian in me, the lover of history in me, kind of did a sort of a historical analysis of how the church in throughout its various epochs has influenced society and influenced the ways in which Black men not only see themselves, but think of themselves and understand and practice a certain practice, the way they engage with certain practices, the way they perform their masculinities on a daily basis. And of course, then, so it then pushed me into a sort of that kind of trajectory, just looking to understand what has been the contribution of Ikawa in how we understand, how Black men understand themselves. And the interesting thing is that even for those who in the 21st century, that even though we may not be churched, but the role that colonial missionaries have done in shaping society, South African society, in very subtle and particular ways, still influences how we think, how we do things, how we dress, so it was really out of that context. And with regards now to the frame of reference, or the what you scholars will call your methodological lens, or a theoretical framework, whatever you want to call it, I think it's something I'll touch on, but I particularly decolonial thought and this idea of decoloniality is something that kind of makes sense to me, because it gives voices to those forms of knowledge those forms of knowledges and thought and sort of ideas that have not been that have been cast aside, as it were, within sort of colonial modes of thinking and being. But it's something that I'll get to touch on later, probably within the course of the presentation.
Thank you very much. I must not waste time and give you the platform to unpack. You'll unpack one paper and then we just go into conversation around it and unpack the second one. And everyone who wants to ask the question and write a comment, you're free to do that both on Facebook and here on Zoom. Mr. Tonono, let me give you the platform to unpack your first paper. Thank you.
Okay. Right. I don't know. I thought what I would do is, instead of looking at both papers separately, what would be to look at them, sort of to combine the sort of the thematic areas and make one sort of broad input into the conversation. So much of the work that you will see comes from both of these papers, and is also, it comes from both of these papers. And so, yeah, I've prepared a bit of a presentation. Share screen on that. Let's start here. All right. We'll zoom in Bonisi Flames. Share screen. Now, okay. Now, so just briefly to introduce myself, being Siyabulela Tonono. Yeah, as I've been introduced. Now, to answer the question, before we can have a conversation, we must understand, we must firstly unpack what do we mean by this concept of coloniality and decoloniality, and what are these things? So from colonialism emerged certain patterns of power, and those patterns of power, they still continue to sort of regulate culture, labor, intersubjective relations, as well as the way we produce knowledge way after the fall of official colonialism. So historically, colonialism kind of fell within the African continent in around the 60s and the 70s, with many countries gaining independence then. So from then onwards, the physical form of colonialism, where there was a colonial power that ruled in a physical space in a colony in Africa, kind of it ended. But there still continues certain patterns of power from that are still evident in this day. Essentially, it depicts a very long-standing relationship between European nationalistic kind of thinking and it's that long-standing patterns of those relations of power, and they manifest themselves in not only the thinking and the mentalities, but in the worldviews of both Black and white people. So essentially, within the thinking or within coloniality, or one can sense that one understands that there are hierarchies, a form of being that looks to ensure that seeks to make visible and make audible the modes of thought and being, which have been rejected or placed on the periphery within global knowledge. So essentially, what decolonial thought does is that it challenges the hierarchies that are created within sort of Eurocentric epistemologies. So that's pretty much at the heart of kind of colonial sort of that's the heart and the crux of decolonial thinking, as it were. Now, the starting point for missionaries in the 19th century was this idea of civilizing missions. So with colonialism came many missionary societies. With the British coming to South Africa or Southern Africa, many missionary societies also started doing missionary work within those British colonies. To name but a few, would be the London Missionary Society, and the London Missionary Society, the Wesleyan Missionary Society, and so on. So, and part of the one thing that the key aspects of this idea of civilizing missionaries were really kind of going crazy about civilizing, and it meant not only the sharing of the gospel, but the gospel became tied with the adoption of European dress, housing structures. So we moved from our sort of circular housing structures or African circular structures to square houses with windows and doors. And we then moved, and also another thing that was kind of was the gender norms. And so we moved to more European forms of gender and being. And Umamunoma Chamsangatisani's work kind of delves into how missionaries reorientated gender norms within the Southern African context. So one may consider engaging with that kind of work. But the starting point had always been about naming. So think about how in even to this day, many people have an English name. So upon baptism, the first thing that missionaries would do, they would give you a Christian name. And this is still part of our undercurrent of society. It's still a prevalent thing within South Africa that we all have English names, or not all, but most Black people have English names. And so at the heart of that is the idea that your name, you are not a being until you have an English name. And it's that idea is directed at your sense of identity and your sense of being. So that was the first thing that was expected out of missionary, out of converts, or out of Black converts. Another thing that was expected out of converts, particularly male converts within the church. So missionaries had this rejection of African cultural and African customs and rites of passage and traditions. So the initiation rite of Ulwaluko, for example, was mainly rejected by most missionary societies. As an example, the Methodist Church of Southern Africa or the Wesleyan Missionary Society had a policy which they called the heathen customs policy, which was basically a policy to say this is how Methodist missionaries are to deal with heathens within their mission stations. So an example of some of the things that the policy governed was that one, if a child was, so firstly, you could not be baptized or you could not be a Christian if you were polygamous. And this is a question now that, for example, the London Missionary Society was questioned about this. David Livingstone was questioned about this. But how can you have a problem with polygamy when the very same book that you're preaching, we were told of King Solomon and King David, and King Solomon had millions or thousands of wives, and you have issues with us. And so there was that kind of question, that idea of polygamy being problematized was questioned by Black men, and also other institutions as well, such as Ulobola. Ulobola was a very highly contentious issue. As I've said, Ulwaluko, Intonjana, and these were all forms of, these were all customs through which African people came into their being. So as Ikwekwe kwaXhosa, as Ikwekwe inja man, you're not a being. You don't, and by that I mean you do not have a social being. You only come into societal being upon Ulwaluko, in the truest sense. So when you then reject the idea of this custom, which is so central to Black men and how they understood themselves, then essentially you are rejecting a big part of their identity and their ontology. And so within missionary thinking, there was this belief that there are only two rights: the ways of heathens and the ways of heathenism, and the way of God's word. So essentially, this whole, when we look at this idea of civilizing missions, the only way Black men could become fully men, or could attain some form of humanity, was through either colonial missionary education or colonial labor, or integration into the colonial capitalist market, as a form of cheap labor, basically. So you could only become a person through going through these going through missionary education, or being a form of cheap labor, as it were. And all of these sort of ideas were central in missionary thinking. And so these were essentials of this idea of civilizing missions. And part of missionary education is that it emphasized an English culture, it emphasized English language, it emphasized English, everything English and everything British was valorized within sort of missionary education. A remnant of that is the way in which most missionary schools cherished sports like rugby, cricket, particularly the gentleman's game in cricket. So even to this day, or Hilltown, Nquebe is a cricket loving community, and that comes out of that tradition of Nquebe started, or Hilltown was one of the major centers of missionary activities in the 19th century. So places like Nquebe then became the embodiment of such ideologies in one way or the other. And of course, Black people then somewhat, I don't want to say distorted it, but they took cricket and ran with it and did with it what they saw fit with it, contrary to the kind of the missionary thinking and the British cultural thinking. So ultimately, the point I'm getting at is that missionary education and South African education, the South African education system that we have today is a product of that kind of Victorian public school kind of thinking, which espoused certain values, espoused certain traditions. It emphasized a certain thing. So it essentially sought to sort of cultivate a particular form of masculinity that was centered around industry, and from that then developed the industrial schools. To mention just a few, or let me mention an example of a Methodist industrial school, or what started as a Methodist industrial school, a place where William Shaw Kama was studied, and abantwana bakagama Kachungwa also studied there, and that was this was this was around Salem, close to Grahamstown. Now, how these industrial schools and these missionary initiatives worked is that people would be given sort of these communities were formed from grants of land, and within those communities, the expectations was that if you are given a piece of land, you are then supposed to cultivate it using the plow, using sort of British technology of the time, and go into those modes of production which were British. Now, there were issues about that because Black men understood themselves differently, and I think it's something we'll touch upon later on. So essentially, missionary education was sort of focused on it was not only focused on men, but it gave also men a superior status to women. And it's this kind of superiority which then the African elite men who participated in these schools kind of in sort of they played into this idea to form a what others have called masculine imperialism. And so again, other scholars, this is no new idea. Scholars like Ifi Amadiume and Sylvia Tamale and a whole host of other African feminist writers have kind of pointed to this idea of how the gendered nature, of how Black men, particularly within the missionary setup, kind of took on these ideas about patriarchy and became and embodied those sort of European patriarchies. So essentially, through a missionary education that emphasized Western lifestyles, Black masculinities were sort of dismembered, because these communities where these industrial schools were formed operated by removing people from their own communities and from their own sense of kinships to be established in mission stations, right? And to establish themselves within those mission stations. So effectively, it meant you were physically being dislocated from your own kin and kinship in one way or the other. So and also now imagine then what happens when a woman says she wants to join, she's interested in this Christianity thing, and it turns out that firstly she's married to a polygamous man, which was frowned upon within missionary thinking at the time. So one of the things was that this woman would be forced then to divorce. Children from missionary from polygamous homes were not allowed within mission stations and were not allowed to be Christian. Therefore, they could not even attend missionary schools. So part of getting this missionary education relied a lot about you distancing yourself from your being and your sense of being. a typical example in history. Ukama kaChungwa, on a number of times rejected Ukama inkosi yamagumkhwebe. Now, as izizwe zamaXhosa are people abazi ubana siyandiselana thina as a form of strengthening ties and allegiances. And on a number of times, Ukama rejected inkosazana from ezinye izizwe, which was something akin to starting a civil war, basically. You can't reject umntana wasebukhosini as a wife, because it means it means something else. It means you're rejecting of esosizwe that was looking to extend that friendship. So Ukama, for example, Ukama rejected a number of wives because of this belief that a man was to be one wife, and this rejection of the idea of polygamy. Now, another key issue that I want to touch upon is this idea of laziness. Laziness is one of the tropes that missionaries associated with Black people. And this was mainly because of how Africans lived. Within African gendered forms of division of labor, there are certain things that are women's domains, and there are certain things that are the domain of men. So, for example, inkomo and the inkomo, the looking after of cattle generally was the domain of men. Ukuzingela or hunting, that was the domain of men. And if inkomo, particularly inkomo, became the domain of boys. So and so when missionaries arrived, they saw Black men just essentially, and they considered this thing to be laziness. And the domain of agriculture, the domain of agriculture, the domain of crop production was exclusively a woman's thing. And there's a particular reason for that. Because within African modes of thinking and being, the earth is a woman in this sense. When you give a woman and the earth a seed, both of them will give you fruits. And I want you to play along with that idea. So within African cosmology, the woman has always been conceived of as the embodiment of Mother Earth. And therefore, anything that has to do with the earth was relegated to the domain of women. And now missionaries kind of thought, there's no sort of, it's only a lazy man who would let his wife plow the fields. And another thing is that this ox-drawn plow, or ikuba, it was a new technology which kind of blurred the ideas. So ikuba eli brings this ox, which is the domain of men, into a domain that is originally of that of women, which is planting of crops. So in that way now, men were being drawn into something that within their worldview was something very effeminate. It was something, and to attest to that, even the concept of ilima is ilima is mainly into your mama, even to this day, even as much as how times have changed. Now, Broadband, one of the missionary who was the first missionary to start a mission station among Barolong, I think that was in about 1823. He writes, just to stress this idea of the missionaries and laziness, he writes in his book, a man was not to be satisfied by watching his wife work alone in the field, but will purchase a plow and a couple of oxen and plow with him. And that's to say, now men were being integrated into this other world. So yeah. Now, with reference to clothing, clothing the naked heathen became another central cog of this idea of civilizing missions. Now, the industrious man was the opposite of the lazy man. So the African man was always projected as being the lazy man, but the industrious man was this man who was always working, and who's constantly working and is a productive man. This is the man that missionaries kind of idealized. And part of the industrious man was this idea of the suit, or a central part of the industrious man was the idea of the suit. Now, the suit in and of itself is the three-piece suit. So ibhaki, underbhaki, nebhlukwe, which are the sort of the three-piece suit in over the past century, from the 16th century. That has been pretty much the suit, and it has been tailored here and there. So this idea of ibhlukwe, ibhaki, and underbhaki has kind of been the central theme of Victorian masculinities. And so the industrious man had always been the idea, the industrious man was always the one who wore suits. And the suit in and of itself came with its own ideology that was packed within it. A part of that ideology was the idea of muscular Christianity. Now, muscular Christianity is this kind of thinking within Victorian Christianity, where the man is seen as where Christ is seen as all-conquering, and is seen as a muscular subject with power, and is very closely related to the idea of the Victorian soldier and his conquest of the world. Now, so the three-piece suit essentially was the embodiment of how manhood is to be shaped, or of the emerging manhood is to be shaped. And if we look at the Victorian soldier, for example, so think about the red, black, and white dominant color scheme within the Victorian army of the 18th and 19th century. Even so those dominant motifs are the same dominant motifs that you find in churches, in the churches from England, for example, the Methodist Church. So when you think about the idea, the dress code, your mama, for example, who's this? Oh, I forgot the scholar's name, theologian's name. His main idea was that it was through seeing the Victorian dress, or the Victorian riding jacket, that women, bomtandas, or mama bommanyano, looked at this Victorian riding jacket and actually liked it and thought of it and appropriated it for themselves, and it became part of their uniform. To this day, the Victorian riding jacket is part of Missionary, is part of the Methodist Church. Another interesting fact that many don't know is that when we think about the Young Men's Guild within the Methodist Church, they started out with a color scheme of khaki. So uniform was khaki. It was khakis. And at the time, this is now early 20th century, khakis were the fashion. And khakis were the fashion, and closely tied to those khakis, the British Army was also then moving to those khaki motifs within their uniform. So there are close parallels between those and within the uniforms of the Victorian soldiers and Victorian military uniform, and how it is still today, how it still is today. So, for example, think about the motifs of the military motifs in the ZCC, for example. Those khakis, and again, it's the same motifs that were present within Victorian soldiers of the early 19th century. For example, within Amachabe also have those khaki pants which embody those Victorian masculinities. Now, as I am about to conclude, ultimately, the ways in which masculinities, or particularly, there were certain tropes, if I may use that word, that missionaries created about Black masculinities. One of them, as I've said, was laziness. And the other one is this idea of, this obsession with the Black man's penis. So for within, there's a great body of literature that is focused, or missionary literature that is focused on just the Black man as a beast, basically. And the phallus becomes the embodiment of, to say this person is a beast. And this is now, these are some of the aspects that I touch upon in the other paper. And so this idea of this obsession with the Black man's penis and regulating what it does, when it does it, and the ideas, so the ideas around polygamy. One of the issues with polygamy that missionaries sort of detested about it was that it promoted promiscuity. And it came from the sense that black men are these wanton, lustful men who are constantly out there looking looking for sex, basically. And that's the sort of the caricature that missionaries created within their ideas and their projections of Black masculinities. Now, fast forward to the 21st century, you still have shows that are so obsessed with the Black man's penis. An example, we are Jola 99. And again, this obsession about presenting Black men as this wanton sexual brutes is but that kind of thinking that we see within those shows is but a continuation of thinking that was planted by 19th century missionaries. The idea that Black men are irresponsible fathers or irresponsible men. Dudley Kidd wrote a book, another missionary wrote a book called Kafir Socialism. And part of one of his thesis is that Black people do not have the capacity to grow beyond the thinking of a teenager. So they're constantly, so even adults kind of are stuck in this idea of thinking like teenagers. So those kinds of, and these were missionaries who were writing these things about Black people. And essentially what they did and how they thought about it is these projections of Black men as irresponsible, these projections of Black men as infantile, as infantile, are still depictions that we see within modern day projections of shows like We Are Jola 99, shows like what's this Udadako, for example. And all of these shows are centered around the Black man as a sexual brute, ultimately. And those shows they only sensationalize those aspects, but do not delve into the socio-historical contexts out of which these Black men's lives are lived, and the experiences of these Black men, and all of those things. So essentially, what we see today has its origins and as its origins and is planted in 19th century missionary thinking. And on those words, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sia. That was quite a learning curve, and there's a lot to take in as I'm listening to you, because some of the conversation I've had with friends, colleagues, comrades. I the questions I have drafted and for us to have this conversation, just to unpack some of the things. And the first question I have, you write on the paper, the encounter between Christian missionaries and Black men in Africa shaped not only the European views of Black men, but also the ways in which Black men understand themselves in the contemporary South Africa. Now, my question is, how has that affected or shaped the relationship between Black men and Black women?
Yeah, that's a very difficult one. That's a very difficult one. Just to expand on this point about how Black men are shaped by missionary thinking. So think about how Ikwala, among the symbolic things that Ikwala wears, is a British blazer. It's a blazer. Among the things that Ikwala wears is a hat. Again, though all of those are symbolic or are symbols of British sort of thinking. And so in the Eastern Cape today, you know, but you ask yourself, this idea that 200 years ago, are you telling me that there were no men? If ibaji is such a central aspect of woodlord, because but the point I'm trying to get at is just to show you the ways in which missionaries shaped the ways Black men understand themselves. And now it's very complex when it comes to the relationship between Black men and Black women. Firstly, that whole binaristic kind of thinking is a product of logics of coloniality. That idea of always creating schisms, always creating dichotomies. It's a product of sort of colonial thinking. Now, Bell Hooks actually writes a very interesting book on patriarchy and Black men and masculinities. I just forgot the title now. So he writes a very interesting book, and he basically Bell Hooks' argument is that part of the success of patriarchy is that it was able to reel Black men into this idea of the oppression of women, and so particularly the missionary elites or the missionary, they kind of bought into that patriarchy, and then in that way those ideas kind of became hard and fast within South African thinking. So it's a very difficult question to answer, but I think the answer lies somewhere in that midst.
Okay. My second question is, so you see, you also write on the paper, the imposition of British masculine dress codes upon Black men dismembered Black men from their ways of being, only to incorporate them in the British colonial world as a cheap labor. So my question is, how did this impact the lives of Black men when it comes to their relations with culture and traditions, now that they have been dismembered from their own ways of life?
The colonial project is a dismembering project. Dismembering in the sense, so you can think about dismembering. Firstly, let's think about Inhloko kaHinza. Even Inhloko kaHinza today, it was dismembered because the colonial project partly is a dismembering project. So if you go to New Zealand, there was a great fascination with Maori skulls and these societies that this fascination with this Maori skull, because dismemberment, the physical dismemberment of a body now, is a central notion within colonial thinking. but also the dismemberment we talk about in the Ngugian sort of term of concept of dismemberment, of being alienated not only from your culture but your land. So in the context of the Glenn Gray Act, for example, Glenn Gray Act, which kind of required Black men to pay taxes. And for them to pay taxes, this is after having been dispossessed of cattle, their central form of economy. So they are then required to pay money taxes. And the only ways in which they could get money was through working, be it in colonial mines in Kimberley and Johannesburg, or on farms. And again, that in and of itself is a physical dismemberment, because you're being dislocated from your own social system, and you spend now time in Johannesburg, you spend time in Kimberley, you spend much of the year in Kimberley, in Johannesburg, or Johannesburg, or wherever. I myself still, I'm a labor migrant. Labor migrancy is still part and parcel of the South African economy. Not many of us have the luxury of many of us are kind of dismembered by the logics of coloniality, such that and what that means ultimately is that once you get to a Gauteng, or once you get into the colonial urban environment, there are things that cannot be done now. For example, when it comes to clothing, in the 19th century, dress code was regulated. So there were laws within urban areas that Black people cannot come here dressed in their loin skirts and they have to wear a certain kind of dress code, right? And from that emerged what was called kafir stores. So these stores that then were made meant for selling clothing, jewelry, and all sorts of other items that Black men would need within the colonial environment. So essentially, all of that kind of points to this idea of dismemberment. It points to this idea of dismemberment from one's social environment, and then it morphs into something else. And of course, within those spaces of dismemberment, Black people still continue to think and to cherish their own cultural ways. So an example of this is the idea, Istatamia, for example. You cannot talk about colonial labor migration
Am I the only one who lost Sia? Hi, Sia. Hello, can anyone hear me? Is it me who's...
I can hear you, Isa.
Can you hear Sia? Oh, I think we lost Sia from my side. Hi, I think we've lost him.
We lost him. We lost him. Yes. I also think we lost him because I can see that he's not connected. Isa?
Oh. Hi, yes, I can hear you. I can hear you. I'm trying to check him up and see if he's gonna be connected again.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Sorry everyone. I think we've lost him because even his phone is not going through. So sad that we have to cut this conversation short, which was an interesting conversation. But I'm glad he had unpacked most his research, and we're in a conversation of clarifying some of the questions. And I thank everyone for tuning in to the Young Searchers Hub. And I think some of the important questions I had wanted to ask him, but I will also want to pose to each one of us is, firstly, he writes on his paper that colonialism defined Black men as savage brutes and privatized their male dress code, marriage custom, and manhood rites of passage. Missionaries in South Africa sought to civilize them by abolishing practices that they considered as heathen institutions. And the question I had wanted to pose to him, and that I want to pose to everyone who's listening today, is that to be a man in South Africa today, you have to have money. And the question is, how do we then raise boys in such a society where their humanness is reduced to their financial status? How do we undo these definitions of colonial era? How do we undo the understanding of women, of what a man should be? Of course, it's not every woman, but if you look at our social media today, there's this frenzy of men must have this, men must have money, men must have cars, and there's so much pressure towards the Black man in order to have their humanness approved, or rather their manhood being kind of understood as if they're man enough. And we are raising our kids into this society who are males, but also we're raising our girls in this society where we continuously, consciously and unconsciously perpetrating patriarchal systems of what a man means. And the argument will go further to say that while we're saying we're dismantling patriarchy, we're on the other side perpetrating it. I'm saying I want a 50-50 in the home by having the men cook and everything, which is, again, dismantling this whole system. But on the other side, I am saying that, no, the man must have money and the man must provide for me. And on the other side of the same coin, there's a man who wants to exert his power using money, and at the same time, they want a woman to share. Okay, I think Sia has just moved back. Hi, Sia. Oh, he's connecting. So again, the question I'll pose to him: should he be connected? Those are some of the things I would wish us. Hi, Sia. You're on mute.
Hello, Sisi.
We lost you for a moment. But
yeah,
thank you for coming back. Okay. The next question I had for you, and I had just posed to everyone to take it home as something to think about. But now I want us to engage on. You write on your paper, the one Utatako, colonialism defined Black men as savage brutes and privatized their male dress code, marriage customs, and manhood rites of passage. Missionaries in South Africa sought to civilize them by abolishing practices that they considered as heathen institutions. And now we've seen this frenzy on social media that to be a man in South Africa, you need to have money. If you don't have money, sorry, we can't recognize you. And now, how do we then raise young boys in such a society where their humanness is not amassed? How do we then raise young boys in a society where their humanness is reduced to their financial status? How do we undo those definitions of the colonial era? I'm just going to clamp up those questions because they all work together. And how do we undo the understanding of men by women that Indoda must this, Indoda must have money? And in that mix, we still want to have a modern family, a decolonized modern family, where both of us can go to work and come back and cook, and both of us have to contribute in the household. Both men and women seem to not have a balance of how do they work around this, but Indoda must at the end of the day. And if your man can't provide, then you don't have a man. And my concern is on boys. How do we raise boys in that instance. But also, I'm concerned as a mother of a young girl, how do I raise my child in that society that pressures women to have men that have money?
Okay, where do I start? Do I start on the theoretical or okay, I think I've got. Now we must understand that capitalism as an ideology now, we can never separate patriarchy from capitalism, because those two feed off and they feed off each other. They intersect. So we have to look at this in ways of intersectionality, and how patriarchy and how capitalism kind of form and augment each other. And to that regard, Professor Kopano Ratele writes a very interesting sort of analysis of how patriarchy and capitalism coalesce, not only to shape masculine identities, not only to shape male identities and masculinities, but also that those who police those identities become women, among other things. But so part of the struggle is understanding that the struggle is multidimensional. It is multidimensional in the sense that because it is multidimensional in the sense that you can't sort of pinpoint it to one issue. And part of what sort of in my reading of feminism, of course, part of what feminism is aiming at is the destruction of the hierarchies that coloniality has sort of created within our society, and those hierarchies of gender, race, class, and so part of so I understand part of the feminist kind of push as a push against those hierarchies. So we should always be conscious of those hierarchies and how they manifest themselves in a myriad of conversations and contexts. So I think that would be my sense of it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a comment from Bomkazi in our comment section. Interested to hear what Tonono's imagination of 21st century men outside of colonial influence is. And I say imagination because it may be impossible to say what manhood uncorrupted by our history has been would be.
So if I'm getting the question correctly, it really pushes us to imagine a different kind of masculinity, or different kinds of masculinities and different kinds of manhood. And I think for me, the one thing I long for as a man now is a manhood that embodies and that accepts my entire being in its entirety. And I say this, the dominant forms of hegemonic masculinities in South Africa, firstly, do not allow me as a man to cry because I must, and all those governing laws about patriarchy. Patriarchy doesn't allow me to tap into myself as an emotional being fully. And so for me, the 21st century man must be I almost ran into that trap. The 21st century man, among other things, needs to be humanized, because what the colonial influences have done is that they've stripped him of his being entirely, such that what is left of his being is minuscule. It's only his contribution to the capitalist project. And so one of the elements of the 21st century imagination must be the rehumanizing of this man and letting that man come into his entire being as it were, in touch with his entire being, and understanding that cultures cultures are not static. Cultures are evolving. And one of the things I've always appreciated about African customs is that African customs have always been flexible. Mna ndingumtshana orhadebe, ndiyakwazi uyoshwama emahlubini korhadebe because ndingumtshana, ndizalwa yintombi yapha, as I would ekhaya emayekeni. Part of the reasons why that is done is because one, umuntu unamakhaya amabini, but also to ensure that umntana wentombi ozalelwe ekhaya apha. So if you have umntana wentombi ozalelwe ekhaya and uthi kushwama abantwana bonyana balapha kuphela, that means lo mntana ukhulele apha will always be ostracized. And so as a way of accommodating that, kushwanyiswa bani umntana entombi kude kuthiwe nomtshana makeze, nangulo uzelwe kwaTonono kuthiwe makeze kwamakhuzeni azoshwama kwiinyama zakwamakhuzi. Why? Because African customs have shown this propensity to always incorporate and to always include. So our customs are not static, and they've generally been ones that embrace the other. A last historical example. I'll go to, there are many shipwrecked sailors. There are many sailors who were shipwrecked along the wild coast, and found refuge from as far back as the 16th century. So that's about 1530 and so on. That's what Portuguese records tell us. And many of those Portuguese sailors were shipwrecked along the wild coast. There are a number of them who decided, no, I'm not going back. I'm not going back to that sailing thing. I'm going to chill here and I'm going to be with these people. And some of those people, today, accommodating. Okay. So that would be my response to that question.
Thank you very much. As you're talking, you remind me of the book by Mr. Spiwo, where he writes "When a Man Cries," and as he tells the story of this man who grew up in a township called Temba, and he talks about every time of how he defied manhood by crying, because he was not allowed to cry as a man, and he talks every time of the different times where he defined what it means to be a man. And I understand when you talk about the humanness of, if you cannot be allowed to cry as a person, a part of you is being, and he writes that a man that cannot cry is incomplete. Because in that regard, on what you're talking about, that you need to be allowed to be human, which has not been allowed. And the last question I have for you, and I put this one lastly because it's something, again, I want the audience and the rest of us to ponder on. You quote Professor Rantele, and you say Rantele contends that contemporary studies in masculinities reproduce colonial and alienating notions of African and Black African boys, men, and masculinities. And my question is, how do we reconfigure education curriculum to address these complicities and noises that Black men and women navigate through in their everyday lives, where there was divide and conquer, where divide and conquer was used to divide them and instigate among each other, which has led to an us versus them and seeing each other as enemies every day of our lives?
Yeah, no, it's you see the problems of the academy. I don't want to say the academy. Those are problems of knowledge production. Again, those are sites of struggle. Those are sites of battle, as it were. And there are politics involved there. It's the politics of bread and butter. So, for example, late decoloniality is one of the buzzwords within the academy. and everyone is decolonizing. It's decolonial this, decolonial that, add a decolonial to whatever chapter, book chapter, whatever you're writing, because that's the buzzword. And part of reconfiguring, for me, part of reconfiguring those knowledge structures is a classic example is democratizing, and I say that in inverted commas. I want this whole space here, Young Researchers Hub, for me, is one of the ways in which we decolonize that site of struggle of knowledge production. Because for a very long time, knowledge production and the creation of theories has always been something that is locked in the ivory towers of the university. But so for me, one of the ways in which to reconfigure knowledge is a discourse echachalazeni, right? Thatha usibeke ku-Twitter, discourse imini yonke. Must theorize about our experiences, must theorize nge-realities zethu, must theorize ngobunolali, what does ubunolali entail, so conceptualize from your own worldview, and for a long time that has not been happening. We don't conceptualize from our own worldview. Siboleka from other languages to think. So now it's time to guess inkomo yenqoma as an economic principle. What does it tell us? Masebenzise ilwimi zethu as a frame of reference and thinking and situating ourselves in the world. So part of the struggle is that one ulwazi and ulwazi lulapha echachalazini. Discourse mayize echachalazini. Let us theorize and mascinge from our own contextual realities. Masizibone ilokishi zethu as spaces where we can theorize from. A beautiful example of this thing. I recently attended a lecture, a workshop that was done by now where she goes, what she was doing in that whole argument was to look at East Kagoko as a historical repository and as a photographical archive, like East and she theorized about it as a photographical archive, as a place where memory is kept in such a fascinating way. Uba ndiyaziyo nala room divider ndiyaziyo as a plate is and she theorized about it in such a way that it made sense. So yeah, no, we need that thing about masizechachalazini bazalwane. Discourse masizechachalazini masiyishukuxe lento. Because that's when new ideas are going to develop. That's when we're going to be thinking through our own realities through our own lens.
Thank you very much, Busia. And what guys is saying on the comment section, couldn't agree more on your assertion. The refrain, move the center to the periphery. And Sabelo is saying, interesting talk. Thank you to both of you. Siyabulela would say more about the link between the civilizing mission and the attainment of Christian masculinity. I'm particularly interested to the role of race, if any, in the making of hegemonic masculinities. I think that will be your last comment, and just give us your last words and we close the session.
Number one, okay, let's start from this. Within the colonial world, the Black is a non-being. That's within colonial thinking. So missionaries, within their idea of civilizing missions, was to take this non-being and bring it to some form of beingness, which will never be a beingness in any case. Lando ati Dubois in double consciousness, that idea of double consciousness, that as a Black person and other scholars, so Boaventura de Santos will call it, there's always this idea that black men or Black people are considered as non-being. They're in the abyssal zone, as De Santos calls it, and so part of the missionary objective was to take these useless things or these non-beings and bring them as close as possible to some form of humanity, but they would never attain full humanity. And so that's why when in the early 20th century, when now the missionary educated Blacks and these guys who were learned and had all the education and all the qualifications, were saying, but guys, now start treating us like peers. Now you guys said we must go find education, and we got educated, we went abroad, we speak better English than you guys, we are gentlemen, we are refined. Now start treating us like civilized people. And the goalposts shifted, and hence the formation of the ANC. So the ANC was also formed by those kinds of missionary educated Blacks who sort of who had embodied these ideals of civilization. But when the time came, they be treated with equality. It never happened. So the point is, race is always a factor. Race is one of the structural nodes of coloniality. If you are Black, you're a non-being within the colonial logic. You exist in the abyssal zone. Thank you.
That's it from us, the Young Researchers Hub, where science and the public becomes one, where we bring the information that you'll mostly not find because it's either in a library collecting dust, or it's a research paper that is published that you might not have the subscription for. But here at the Young Researchers Hub, we bring the people, we ask them the questions, they tell us what they think, and we educate ourselves. The aim at the end of the day is for all of us to be equipped with information. It's to bridge the gap between the ones who are being researched and the researcher. At the end of the day, they have to become one. As researchers, we cannot continue researching about the people and never going back to the people and tell them what we find. Because once again, as Mr. Tonono say, the information is here with our people. They're the ones who are making us scholars. They're the ones who are giving us this information. And the only service we can give them is if we go back to them. It's a disservice to research about someone and not come back and tell them some of the ideas you have on how they can better their lives. Of course, you're not imposing. As researchers, we are only facilitators, and that's the role we need to play because we've been given an opportunity to learn more. And as Robert Sobuk would say, education to us is service to Africa. And if we cannot service our communities, then we have failed. Our education has been for nothing. And many other people who should have been in the system could not be because we're allowed a chance. And when we're given a chance, we did not utilize that chance. From us, the Young Researchers Hub, we thank everyone who continues to support us and tune in and listen to this conversation. And again, we're still on the third wave. The numbers are rising. People are dying. Please sanitize. Please stay at home if you can. Social distance when you go outside. Protect yourself and protect your loved ones and protect everyone else. It's been a sad week in the country with the riots and everything else. I urge everyone to keep safe and to continuously have the conversation to conscientize each other of what these things mean for us as a Black people. We cannot run away from the impact it will have on us, but we cannot also run away from the historical complexities that has led us to the position we're in. Hence, we're having this conversation to educate one another. From me, it's a good night, and I thank you very much. Have a great weekend, and see you again when we're having another conversation, when we're having another guest to come here and educate us. Thank you very much.
Yeah.